We have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Neptune Hamay, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Oh.
Dr. J, and as always we have a super fascinating show for you today. First, let me say this. I know a lot of people are watching the GOP debate, which I don't want to cause any problems out there for all those people that are listening, but I wouldn't be surprised if it turns into a circus. But nonetheless, that is okay, fine by me. Whatever people want to do, it's their choice, of course. That's what the voting process is about. But nonetheless, that is going on. But while that is going on, we are going to be talking about something much bigger than that. We're talking about angels. And there's so much to do about angels that they go back in history thousands of years. Some people mistake them for aliens. Some people mistake them for dwarves, jinn, elves. You know it. So first of all, let me say, of course, I'm broadcasting from the city of not-so-angelic angels, Los Angeles, and of course, we're at 7:03 p.m. Pacific time. People on the East Coast, near where our guest is, well, I'll shoot that out in a second, unless you watch social media. It's close to either 10:03 p.m. or 10:04 p.m. Eastern, or if he's Central, then it's of course 9. And good old Johnny Webb, where it happens to be 3 a.m. live in London, Greenwich Mean Time. Without further ado, let's bring on our guest, Mr. John RONNER. Mr. RONNER, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Dr. J. It's good to be with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. I've been honestly looking to have someone to talk about this subject for quite some time, and this is our chance. This is our chance for all the listeners globally, and I also want to thank, of course, our newest affiliate station that picked this up in the United Kingdom and anywhere else where people are listening. And if people are listening in their cars, homes, wherever, you want to tune in and turn the volume up. Okay, Mr. RONNER, let me ask you this. What is the definition of an angel?
Well, we have to go back to the medieval philosophers, I suppose, and we have to go someplace. Everybody's going to have his own opinion, but probably the most widespread definition, at least in Western culture, would have come from those philosophers, people like Thomas Aquinas, the great church doctor, the so-called angelic doctor, as a matter of fact, because he had so much to say about it. These individuals felt that an angel essentially is a superior spiritual being. You couldn't say a more highly evolved being, because evolution wasn't really a widespread concept in the Middle Ages, not until modern times. So they typically, Aquinas, for example, had a fairly representative viewpoint. He considered angels to be higher than us in the hierarchy of life, the chain of being, so to speak, in the same way we would stand above the lower forms of life, the lower mammals, the reptiles, amphibians, fish, invertebrates, and so on. They're just they're above us in the chain. He, however, again, did not encompass evolution as a concept. So his viewpoint was that angels and humans were created separately. There was no evolution from a human to an angel. An angel was kind of created ex nihilo, I guess you might say, with all of its wiring and its knowledge intact, kind of like a ROM memory instead of a RAM memory that gets developed, but as the software develops itself and more information is put on, which is how he felt humans developed. So that's been pretty much the standard definition, but of course in modern times the term gets used in a lot of different ways, very loosely, and very often it's used to refer to departed loved ones, particularly bereaved spouses who have lost loved ones.
Hi,
In that
it's Johnny
case, though, we
Webb.
would be talking about... Yeah,
Sorry,
go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Yeah, well, what's the different types of angel encounters that people describe?
Well, they do run a pretty wide gamut. Probably some of the more popular ways that people feel they have interfaced with quote-unquote angels, and again, the term is very loosely used. Some people, for example, one of the most striking ways would be found in near-death experience, which kind of took the public by storm in the 1970s when, well, I guess Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the very early 70s popularized the idea with her death and dying stages. She kind of laid the groundwork for it, and then in the very early 70s, Raymond Moody came along with his classic Life After Life, and I guess opened Pandora's box for, in this case, for the good, by making the near-death experience an ancient phenomenon, widely known for the first time to the Western public, at least. That would be a component of the near-death experience. There are many components to it, but one of them is the appearance of a powerful being of light, so-called, by many of them who were secular. Other people felt that they had been in the presence of God or some great religious figure, maybe Jesus, maybe Buddha. Some people but most people that were secular simply referred to it as a being of light, an all-powerful, highly evolved entity that radiated an overpowering love. This being of light would be one, probably you could think of that as an angel in its native glory appearing. There's a whole other category of experiences in which people feel departed loved ones have interacted with them as quote-unquote angels, although this is not strictly speaking an angel in the medieval scholars' sense of the word. And this is where one of the most frequent manifestations of this category would involve, say, a widow or widower who has lost a loved one, and that loved one continues to intervene really on a routine basis in their lives. I spoke to a widow who told me her late husband continued to make repairs around the house, after he had died. Spoke to another one who felt that her husband had materialized in the car and took control of the steering wheel to get her out of what would have been a terrible traffic accident, and so on. Another category of encounter would involve what I call the voice, or it's a clairaudient category of paranormal phenomena in which people feel that a heavenly voice has spoken to them and guided them, usually directed them to do something at a critical moment that when they were at a crossroads, and made a difference for the good. I spoke to a woman who was driving in traffic, and she just heard a voice out of nowhere in the car saying, "Pull over there," and then she just instinctively looked in the car, kind of stimulus response, and then realized how foolish that was because she was the only one in the car. She just sloughed it off, ignored it, and moved on, continued driving, and the voice called out again, more insistently, "Pull over there." And somehow, instinctively, telepathically, she understood where was. It was a particular house, no particular reason for her to focus on that house, but she knew that's what it was. And even though she drove past the house, she just felt compelled to turn around and go back. Couldn't shake that feeling. Went to the door, knocked on it. The door opened, and an individual stood there, a middle-aged woman, and said, "Thank God you're here. My husband has just collapsed, and I don't know what to do." And the driver had a lot of know-how about her and common sense, and took charge of the situation, got emergency help there. So this clairaudient type of activity occurs quite a bit. You've got people, you have another interesting phenomenon called the mysterious stranger, which crops up all the time. Typical way of describing that would be just to cobble together the various parts of the experience into kind of a synthetic synopsis, I guess you might say. Let's assume you're just driving down the road, and all of a sudden your car breaks down, and as you're preparing to leave the vehicle to take a look at under the hood, you suddenly see a pickup truck pull up. You had just scanned the horizon, maybe a quarter of a mile in both directions, and seen nothing, but this vehicle just appears out of nowhere, And before you get a chance to take further action, a gentleman or woman, usually very striking in appearance for some reason to the experiencer, steps out of the vehicle and may announce something typically like, "Oh, I know what the problem is. It's right under the hood. I have the part for that. It's the distributor cap. I just happen to have one. I'm going to replace it." And by the way, and as they immediately go to start replacing the part, they begin discussing your own personal life as if they know you. By the way, I know you're having trouble at the office. You're thinking about leaving your job, but I would caution against that because this boss that's giving you so much trouble is about to be let go. And if you'll just hang on for a few more days, and you're thinking to yourself, how does he know these things? And meanwhile, he's fixing the problem, and next thing you know, the hood's shut. Your attention is diverted. The moment you look back, the vehicle is completely gone. You didn't even hear the tires turn. You didn't hear the engine crank back up. You look, there are no tracks leading away, and there are none coming to the side. Now that's just the typical cobbled together representation of that type of encounter. That's very, very common. I guess, and we could go on and on, but probably the single most common way that people interface with quote-unquote angels or the spiritual or however you want to describe this would be synchronicity. This Carl Jung's term, the great psychiatrist coined that in the last century to describe, I guess, what you would call meaningful coincidence, where he felt that there were two connecting forces in nature, cause and effect, the logical, turn the faucet, out comes the water. And he likened that to the masculine or yang principle and connective force in nature. And he felt that the feminine mystical side of that was what he called synchronicity or meaningful coincidence, which joins things together on the basis of meaning, not on the basis of external logical cause and effect. And synchronicity operates mostly like a dream, where things just seem to happen together in an illogical jumbling, but when you awaken and start analyzing the dream, you see that all these elements, these seemingly disparate elements, are actually connected logically. They're connected by their meaning, not logically.
A lot of people, I was going to say, first of all, don't report this type of activity because there's been a lot of cases that I've known about where people have been saved by angels. And when you were starting to talk about that woman who pulled over the side, I was first starting to think it was an old, Unsolved Mysteries case where a woman was told to go to the side, but obviously you clarified the story. It wasn't that same case. What she was told was to pull over on the side, and right behind her was a mad wreck. And not only that, if she hadn't pulled over and been involved in the wreck, she wouldn't have been able to resuscitate the motorcyclist who was involved in the car accident and was thrown into the water and was unconscious. And so she saved him because of what an angel had told her to do. But because of us living in such a materialistic world, I think a lot of this goes, unpublished, not necessarily in books. I'm just talking about unspoken. But how many cases, or how often do you have cases of people reporting angelic activity to you?
Well, that whole matter that you brought up is interesting to me. Yes, angelic phenomena, surprisingly, even in the 21st century, is to some certain extent a hush-hush subject that's just not brought out. One reason, I think, is because of the intimacy of it. Even in today's freer and more freewheeling society than the kind of world I grew up in the 50s and 60s, people are still, you still have that element. Something is so sacred and so private, it's difficult for some people to talk about it. But it was really under wraps. I'm 64 now. When I was in my teens and 20s, it was really under wraps until it was blown open by all the publicity about the near-death experience back in the 70s. So we have come a long way in that respect. My feeling is that one of the things that to get back to the main question, Time magazine had a poll in 1993 at the height of the angel boom, the early 1990s, and they asked representative sampling, just a pretty straightforward question. To what extent do people feel that they had interfaced with angels? And 69% felt, first of all, that they believed in angels, and that might not come as such a shock today, but it did in the early 90s. 46% felt that they had a personal guardian angel, a further shock to what was still then, to a certain extent, a secular society. And just under a third felt that they had experiences with their guardian angels. And other surveys began following. There was another one in which, and of course they vary in results, but they all pointed to the fact that a strong minority, for example, of the American public felt that they had a near-death experience. I think by one count, 1 in 20. The National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, run by Father Greeley, Andrew Greeley, the prominent researcher and writer, turned up the fact that as many as 50% of widows and widowers felt that they had been in touch with their spouse, their departed spouse, and a very strong minority felt that they had interacted with someone who had died. So for the first time, I'd say in the beginning in the 70s and climaxing in the 90s, Western society finally came to grips with the fact that whatever this phenomenon is, it's very widespread, and huge numbers of people have participated in it. And up until I was in my 20s, most of them kept quiet about it most of the time. So
what do angels do? So sorry, John. What do angels do most often when an encounter occurs? Why are we having encounters with angels?
What do you say that again? What do you do when an encounter occurs? Was that the question?
Yeah, what do angels do most often when an encounter occurs? What is the purpose of an angel in an encounter?
Oh, well, it depends on what's happening. For example, we were talking about people react differently because in some cases, this usually used to be the case quite a bit. People didn't even know what was going on. If someone's having a near-death experience, they used to have them in isolation until all the publicity occurred. They would, again, it depends on the genre. If you're witnessing a being of light in the near-death experience, it's said to be overwhelming. You're clearly in the presence of some superior spiritual being, and the love, the compassion, the empathy level is just overpowering. And near-death experiences describe it as something not only unforgettable, but they were very, very reluctant to part. Comments typical would be, "I could have basked in that glow of love forever." The nature of the being of light varies. Some people feel it's a divine part of themselves. Others feel it is an angel or some other superior spiritual being. But for most of us, I'd say the most common experience being meaningful coincidence or synchronicity. It's not as dramatic, but it's still quite striking. The Westside Baptist Church some decades ago experienced a gas explosion which obliterated the whole building and blew parts of it all over town. That blast occurred about 7:30 p.m. on a Wednesday night. When normally
was that choir practice? The choir practice case?
That's right. One of the most interesting synchronicity stories out there, and it caused a sensation worldwide when it took place. I think it was the 70s and 80s, I believe. All 15 choir members, for mundane reasons that differed one from another, were late that night. Not a single person showed up for choir practice. It's the only time that ever happened before or since the blast in the century-plus lifetime of that church.
And the pastor as well, because he was very strict on attendance.
Yeah. Even the regulars, yes, even the regulars were gone. And of course, there are synchronicities all over the place. When after Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, there were major articles all over the country about the synchronistic links between the Kennedy and the Lincoln presidencies. Both of one was elected in 1860, one in 1960. Their vice presidents were both named Johnson, each elected exactly 100 years apart, just as the presidencies were 100 years apart. In this case, 1808, 1908. Oh, they were both vice presidents were Southern Democrats. Both of them, as I said, were named Johnson. They both both presidents assassinated by individuals who were known by three-part names: John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald.
That's
both
right.
of them were seated next to their wives. It goes on and on. And really, that's just a fraction of it. I mean, Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was in a Ford automobile at the time, and the model of the Ford was a Lincoln. Lincoln's assassin shot him in a theater, fled to a warehouse. Kennedy's assassin shot him from a warehouse and then fled to a theater. So on and on.
And wasn't there one more synchronicity as well? Wasn't the secretary of Lincoln or one of them named last name Kennedy, and vice versa when Kennedy was president?
Yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, there's dozens of more things we could say. I just can't think of them all right now, Dr. J. But there are just tons and tons of them. The presidential death cycle is another major synchronicity, and I guess the happy-go-lucky, good luck Reagan broke that cycle. Although he almost succumbed to it. I mean that supposedly started with William Henry Harrison in 1840 and took every president elected in an even-numbered year every 20 years from 1840 all the way up to 1980. And as I said, even Reagan took a bullet. He didn't die, though.
That's right. That was in his first term, not too long after he was elected. Was it 81, 82?
That's right.
Like that? Yeah.
That's right.
Now,
that's right.
We live in a free market society with religions available to anyone. So if you're a Muslim or Buddhist, you're accepted. But America and the United Kingdom and even other countries on the Western world are primarily Judeo-Christian. I want to ask you, do angels appear in the other religions, or do they have another definition for them, but they're the same thing?
Depends on how far you go out in the cultural map there. As you start getting further and further from quote-unquote home, wherever home is here in the West, the angels begin looking a little different. But the angels, as we know them in the Judeo-Christian tradition, are largely shared by Islam too. It's because Muhammad derived a lot of his information from the Christians and the Jews that he ran into, in his lifetime, that were scattered about the Near East there. So the kind of definition of an angel doesn't vary too much. As a superior spiritual being, a courtier of the divine court that is dispatched on missions, and that's of course the etymology of the word angel. It comes from angelos in Greek, meaning messenger, any kind of a messenger in ancient Greece, human or divine. Once you get beyond Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and you start pushing further afield, let's say into Buddhism, you begin to run into more varieties of superior beings. Probably a rough equivalent maybe in Buddhism to what we think of as an angel might be a bodhisattva, kind of a mortal who eventually purifies himself to the point that he no longer has or she no longer has to reincarnate, but they voluntarily choose to continue coming back to the lower physical plane in order to help their fellow humanity, and are able to achieve various feats as they do so. And some of the bodhisattvas will, according to this idea, will materialize or incarnate themselves deliberately in one of the various Buddhist hells in order to help lost souls down there rise. So it does get beyond this particular discussion, but every major religious background, in the sense of a major religion today, organized religion, would have angels in some form or another.
I come from England and come from a sort of Christian background, and as I grew up as a kid, I think of like movies like It's a Wonderful Life, and you hear the story, every time the bell rings, an angel gets his wings. But when you look in the Bible and references, it doesn't ever mention these beings having any wings. A bit like the winged disc sort of symbol. It's more of a symbolism of transportation or movement in the sky. Well, why do we have symbolisms of wings with angels? And I suppose it's my question, is there any evidence or proof that angels are real?
Well, now the symbolism, taking that part first, that we can lay a lot of that at the feet of artists who are always trying to depict in a concrete form an intangible characteristic or trait, and angels as spiritual beings moving, supposedly with the power of thought, or at the speed of thought, I guess I'm trying to say, would be very fleet-footed, as it were. And in fact, near-death experiencers who find themselves in spiritual bodies report that they can move at the speed of thought. To be in a new place is simply to think yourself there, and you're there. So this fleetness of foot, this speed, or this velocity has been shown symbolically by artists as a pair of wings over the years. The original Christian iconography and depictions of angels did not have angels wearing wings. That's something that appeared either in late ancient times or early medieval times. But we have that. The halo is another one that's along the same lines. The halo shows up in a lot of different ways. You've got the stylized little ring, gleaming ring that you would see in the Renaissance paintings. You've got the solid circular two-dimensional disc behind the saints and the angels in Byzantine art, and among other ways of depicting it. And what the artists are trying to do there is just show the angel's body of light, similar to the being of light that is often reported in a near-death experience. And you can think of it as kind of like a clairvoyant looking at a human being and seeing an aura body extending beyond the contours of the physical body. That's what they're up to there. So it goes on from there, but it's essentially symbolism. As far as the idea of the reality of angels, we are real deep into philosophy on this one. It's an art, whether the supernatural is, whether we live in an organic universe, a living, growing, intelligent, sentient, universal being of which you might say we might be individual cells, a part of it, or whether the universe, by contrast, is just a cold, accidental, soulless, unintelligent, dumb, lumbering machine that just came into being by accident. Well, that's the question that's been debated for 5,000 years of recorded history, and the jury's still out on that one because nobody can prove their case one way or the other, and that's one thing, in my opinion, that makes it so satisfying. I find it intellectually interesting. Now, of course, I'm on the side of the angels, no pun intended. I do think that the materialist concept has been fading steadily. It probably peaked around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century and was still going very, very strong when I was born in 51. But the rise of quantum physics has probably done more than anything else, in my personal opinion, to undermine the hegemony of the materialist / scientific viewpoint. Science itself, of course, is not undermined and never will be. It's a wonderful way of analyzing the world logically, picking it apart, analyzing it, and improving it. And the Western civilization has made gigantic strides as a result of that. I mean, the smartphone I'm holding in my hand is a result of science.
That's right.
But
I'm glad you mentioned improvements because we have to improve our science. We have to accept that we don't know everything. There's still unknowns out there that we can go further. Yeah, and I was going to say too. I think quantum physics is a little appreciated development because it's off the screen of most people. But you have to ask yourself, why has there been such a radical shift in our culture? There's a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, more openness in society, more tolerance for a wide range of viewpoints, far more than I saw when I was a teenager or a kid. So that's one thing. But I think something has been working on the intelligentsia, the intellectual leadership of our culture, and it's been working on them for decades. You had very great men like Isaac Asimov and Carl Sagan that I deeply respect, but they were essentially materialists. They were wonderful guys, but essentially materialists. Today, it's much more nuanced when you get up to that level. When you get to men like Paul Davies, the scientist, who wrote
trailblazing book back in the 80s called God and the New Physics. I think quantum physics has shown that way down there, where the world is very, very small, dimensions smaller than the atom, our type of reality just breaks down, and nothing really seems to have any existence mathematically or observationally unless something with consciousness is looking at it. In other words, it appears that in order for things to be quote-unquote real down there in the quantum world, they have to be observed. Somebody has to be looking at them, experimenting. If a scientist doesn't measure the mass of a neutron, it has no mass. Now, it sounds Alice in Wonderland to talk like this. If a scientist doesn't ask himself, where is this proton, and if he doesn't go looking for it and pinpoint it, it has no position. And we're not saying here, well, wait a minute, John, of course it has a position, we just don't know where it is. No. We're not saying that. We're saying that position does not exist. It doesn't exist observationally, and here's the kicker. It doesn't exist in the mathematics either. It's not there until we look, something with consciousness look. Now, you might say, well, that's okay, fine. That's just down there. But the problem is, you and I and everybody's listening to this program, we're all made up of, 100 trillion cells?
Yes.
And each one has hundreds of thousands of molecules. Each one of a DNA molecule has 1 billion atoms in it. And every one of those atoms has countless subatomic particles, and those subatomic particles don't exist unless we look at them. So we're living in a big building where the bricks are ghostly. If you step back a distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, it looks real solid, but the closer you get to the building, the fuzzier it gets until finally it disappears by the time you get there to touch it. That's kind of a rough, crude metaphor. So I think this is one of the things that's given science pause in being so materialistic. Now, science is wonderful, but sometimes when things work really well, we try to extend it too far, and it's the materialism that goes with science is not really science itself. It's more of a philosophy.
I have a question that I wanted to ask you, but actually, surprisingly, and not surprisingly, multiple people are asking the same question. Two in particular have written it, I don't want to say verbatim, but close. John in Manhattan, as well as Connor in Ireland, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask it now. Why do angels help some and leave others to tragedy? I mean, is there a reason why some are left to die or drowned, whereas others are saved?
I think the philosophers call this one the problem of evil. And you can ask this question in a lot of ways and from a lot of directions. Why did God let this happen? Why? I think there's never been a satisfactory answer to that question. It's a provocative question, though. I do think that you can make a stab at trying to analyze it. For one thing, we live, some creative intelligence, in my opinion, has decided that, we're going to live in a world that is not perfect. And in order to, by definition, I suppose, if you're going to live in a world that is imperfect, things have to go wrong. People have to be allowed to make bad decisions. Somebody has to be allowed to, build a house on the beach knowing that there might be a hurricane coming someday to blow it away and catch him and maybe blow him to kingdom come. So random crime can occur because people have to be allowed, if you're going to have an imperfect universe, to make mistakes and make wrong decisions and develop the wrong attitudes. But that also allows them to be educated and to be corrected and to be rehabilitated. And in other words, life is an adventure. It's an arena. And how can you have an exciting experience if nothing can ever go wrong? There was a famous episode in the Twilight show, the old Twilight Zone series with Rod Serling, and in that episode, a common criminal. It began with a common criminal and I think a firefight or something with the cops. And in the next scene, he woke up and he was in what appeared to be a paradise, a heaven, as presumably he'd been shot. And the old actor from the 60s, Sebastian Cabot, who was very big in his day, was playing the role of his guide through this heavenly afterlife. And in this afterlife, everything he wanted happened immediately. It was a perfect world. All he had to do was think about it, and it was there for it. Everything he tried to try for, he achieved without any effort. Got it right away. No resistance. This went on for a week or two. At first, it was blissful. Then it got tedious, and finally, it just got absolutely intolerable. And at the end of the episode, he just cried out indignantly to Sebastian Cabot's character. He says, "This is some cockeyed idea of heaven." And of course, as you kind of expect, the butler said, "Well, I'm sorry, sir. There's been a mistake here. You're not in heaven." So a perfect world would be a hellish and boring experience, and that may be one reason. Other people, karma comes up sometimes as an explanation for the problem of evil. The idea that we live in a balanced universe. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a whole essay on compensation, which I highly recommend to any literary-minded people out there. If you really enjoy reading, that's one of the best works in my opinion, one of the best metaphysical summaries in English literature. He talked about how the universe demands balance, and that when we enter what you might call a debit for ourselves in the cosmic ledger, we're going to have to pay that debt just like you'd have to pay for a bag of potato chips that you take. One way or the other, you have to pay. In fact, it was one of his slogans in that essay. He said, "First, you must always pay," quote unquote, and he meant it in every sense of the word. He said, "Keep those accounts balanced." And so it might be that if, for example, the Hindus are right about reincarnation, and we don't know that they are, we don't know that they aren't. But if they are, it might be that some things that happen in the current life may be the result of a mistake made in a past life. Certainly in my own life, and it's not necessarily a negative thing when we suffer setbacks. In my own life, I can assure you, some of the most disastrous things that ever happened to me have turned out to be have been some of the best things pushing me forward. And you see that happen in the whole sweep, and the whole sweep of the development of life in the universe. But one of the most disastrous things, quote unquote, that ever happened in the history of the development of life on Earth was the Cretaceous impact 65 million years ago, when the meteor came and wiped everything out. Of course, we've got different theories about that.
I was just going to say, and that was also the sixth
and as a result,
ETE, extinction level event, or ELE, ELE.
Yeah, that's right. And as a result of that, what happened? We're here. We're here because the dinosaurs were wiped out, all those evolutionary niches were emptied out, and all these mammals, all these clever, little intelligent, furry mammals have been crawling around for tens of millions of years, waiting for their chance to get on the stage, but stuck out in the wings because the main actors, the dinosaurs, were out there on the stage lumbering around. It cleared the decks, I'm trying to say, that massive extinction event. And then the mammals moved in very quickly and filled all those niches and began to evolve very rapidly because they had superior brains. And as a result, we came along, depending on your definition of humanity, anywhere from 3 to 5, 6 million years ago, and here we are. That meteor hadn't hit. Yeah.
But where does our modern idea of angels come from, though?
The modern idea?
Yeah.
Well, are you talking about the modern? If we're talking about angels as we conceive of them today, it's kind of fractured. Some people are alluding to the near-death experience, as I said earlier, and some people are talking about dead loved ones. Some people are when they're saying angels or I had an angelic experience, they're talking about I guess a loved one, not a loved one, but a synchronicity or a meaningful experience. So you kind of have to define what they're talking about. But the modern idea is much more multifaceted than what existed in the Middle Ages, where, for example, a medieval would have resisted the idea of any contact between the living and the dead. There was a concept called the communion of the dead, in the idea that no one is ever really spiritually separated from anyone else. Loved ones and the dead are always together in the bosom of God, I guess you might say, in His creation. But contact between the living and the dead was kind of frowned upon, and you can get it, and not just in medieval European culture, but you also see that going all the way back to the Judean roots, the roots in in the Middle East, the Old Testament, where you have, for example, Saul being criticized for conjuring the ghost of Samuel using the witch of Endor to use it. It's an Old Testament story, and supposedly I can't even remember what it was Saul wanted to know, but Saul wanted to know. But when Samuel appeared, the greatest of the Hebrew judges, he rebuked Saul for doing that because he had conjured the dead. Now we're much more liberal about these things, and it seems almost natural that your loved ones might appear and socialize with you.
Johnny's got a personal question to ask you. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, while we're on the lines of that, my mum died a couple of years ago, and she was a born again Christian. She believed devoutly that Jesus died for her, and when she died, she came back and spoke to my brother's daughter, my niece, and she's a bit of a medium sort of psychic, and she said that my mother had come to her in a dream and let her know that she was younger looking and looked well. And then a couple of months later, she come back to her again and said, look, I know I haven't been to see you for quite some time, but I've been made an angel and I've got a lot of work now to do, so you probably won't see me again in this form. And I felt that was mad. So my question was, do human beings become angels when they die?
Well, the medievals would have said no. In modern times, you might have a different answer. Somebody like Thomas Aquinas, who I mentioned earlier.
Yes, there's a famous novena about him.
Yeah, he would have said no, that's never going to happen because an angel is born an angel, a human is born a human, and God created them as separate classifications, and that's that. However, going back to what I said earlier, remember evolution was not a concept of a widespread concept in medieval times, and even in the 19th century when it finally arose, it was fierce resistance. I think there was a famous comment from Benjamin Disraeli, is man an ape or an angel? I, my lord, I am on the side of the angels. So, but eventually evolution was accepted. So today there's a major alternative viewpoint which would see a kind of an evolutionary continuum with angels representing a more highly evolved form of what we are already. So according to this theory, a human being growing in wisdom and love and compassion would eventually attain to angelhood somewhere down the line, evolving. So you can take your pick there. Yeah.
Well, what is the difference between, an angel, a ghost, an alien abduction? People that see aliens see ghosts and angels. Is there a difference?
Glad you're asking that, Johnny, because that's actually a question that we just got from Kevin from Florida, who asks, is there a difference between extraterrestrials and angels when you pass? Or are they coming from somewhere else, another dimension, or...
Yes. Well, first of all, angel and ghost, and then we'll move into that. An angel and a ghost are radically different. Yes, a ghost is just a departed or dead human being. It doesn't have the power or the stature of an angel. If you run into a ghost, you're not going to be overwhelmed with by being in the presence of a divine being, so to speak, as you would in the presence of a being of light. A ghost would, even a ghost of a loved one, while you might be overwhelmed with feelings of love for someone that meant so much to you, it's still not the same as being in a semi-divine presence, I guess you might say. As far as aliens are concerned, there are a lot of different theories about that. I mean, some people would say no, aliens occupy their own sphere. They're simple, and these are just opinions. Extraterrestrials coming to the Earth, they're just another race. They're not really. There's nothing particularly paranormal about them. But then there are others who have begun, especially in recent decades, taking the viewpoint that that alien phenomena might actually just be a branch of metaphysical experience itself. And I haven't delved too deeply into that. There was I think a classic book, Angels and Aliens, that was very well researched and went into great detail about the metaphysical aspect of alien sightings. I'd be hesitant. I'm not going to take a pen and just start marking out experiences people have and say, well, that's angelic, that's not angelic, because it really just depends on the opinion of the individual having the experience. I certainly, some of these alien encounters have aspects of angelic experience.
Let me ask you this. Of course, in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, there was a hierarchy of angels. Specifically, we had Satan, who was God's right-hand angel, the top angel, who decided he wanted to be God, and then, of course, was banished to his own hell, and that's that's where the heaven and hell comes from now, and that's why anybody who's doing something bad is presumed punished in hell. So let me ask you a question. Is that hierarchy actually existing, or is it just human interpretation of it?
It's hard. I would say that the actual angelic hierarchy, it would be logical to have an angelic hierarchy, just as we, if you look at the visible universe, from us all the way down to the most primitive forms of life, and where life starts, who can say? I mean, is a virus alive or isn't alive? It's more like a sliding scale or a continuum of complexity. But what you see is you just see greater and greater complexity at each level. You see atoms with seeming intelligence collecting together to form a DNA molecule, of millions of atoms in a single DNA molecule cooperating with one another exclusively. And then you'll see hundreds of thousands of molecules cooperating with one another in a very, very intricate dance inside one single cell, like bees in a hive. And then you see cells cooperating to form multicellular organisms like us right now. So I guess if you look and see this increasing complexity going all the way up to us, you have to assume that there's no reason why this complexity would not increase beyond us, up higher and higher. In fact, the philosophers addressed this question over the centuries and devised what was called the chain of being theory, which is the idea that angels, the idea is that an angelic world of greater and greater complexity of angels ought to exist, because if you look at the visible world, you see that increasing hierarchical, greater and greater complexity leading up to us. So why would this not continue beyond us? Surely humanity is not the apex of the universe.
That's right.
And that's the conclusion. Yeah, that's the conclusion the philosophers came to. And so they adduced this so-called chain of being as evidence in the courtroom, where the great battle is going on between materialism and metaphysical thought. It doesn't prove anything, but it's what I call circumstantial evidence, which goes back to an earlier question during the hour. Whether we've gotten to the point where we've proven it. No, we haven't.
Well, and this also fills in with the fallen angels, because that's what Satan was. He was banished to become a fallen angel, right?
Yes, he was God's. In Christian lore. A lot of this stuff actually didn't get into Scripture, but in Christian lore, ancient Christian lore, he was God's viceroy, God's viceroy, and he committed the greatest of the 7 deadly sins, which was arrogance, and decided to take God's place, and a third of the heavenly host rose up with him to try to dethrone God, you might say, and there was a huge war in heaven, and eventually the bad angels were cast out of heaven and plummeted down into hell, and the battle continued from there. It's interesting. It's kind of a Christian version of the ancient Zoroastrian idea of spiritual warfare. The Zoroastrian religion of the ancient Persian Empire originated this idea. It's worth noting just intellectually that in ancient Judaism there was no concept of spiritual warfare and no concept of a heaven and hell, not originally. It developed later, probably scholars suspect during the Babylonian captivity of the 6th century BC, when Judea had risen up a couple of times against the Babylonian Empire. Babylonians put down the first rebellion, and then lo and behold, 10 years later, here they're rising up again. So the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, got tired of it and crushed the Judean revolt, the second time he razed the whole city to the ground. He didn't spare anything. And this time around, he took the Jewish intelligentsia back to Babylon with him as hostages against a third rebellion, make sure a third one didn't break out. Now, interesting thing happened during the Babylonian captivity. All these Israelite intellectuals were put into contact with the intelligentsia of the Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. Babylon later was conquered by Persia, but at this time it was just Babylon. And so they began to pick up ideas from the Persian Zoroastrian religion, spiritual warfare, the existence of a heaven and hell, the existence of a devil leading the evil forces. Interestingly enough, in Zoroastrianism, everything had a happy ending. Even though you had a heaven and a hell, you didn't have eternal damnation. It was the damnation and the punishment only lasted until the end of time, when the final battle occurred and Ahura Mazda, the god of light, defeated Ahriman, the Zoroastrian devil. And at that point, a molten lava swept through the whole universe, burning and purifying all of the impure souls. It was for the good souls who were already pure, there was no pain. For the ones who that were impure, there was tremendous pain. But it was all in a good cause because it got all the, I guess you might say, the nastiness out of them.
Let me ask this real quick. Interrupt. We're going to come close to the bottom of the hour. I was going to ask you if you don't mind going 10 minutes past, because we could fill that in for the replays when it goes to the other networks. Obviously, would that be okay with you?
Sure, that's fine. We'll do it. Yeah. Sure.
Okay. All right. Continue and then I know Johnny's got some question from another.
Well,
listener.
I was in the process of dispatching all the wrongdoers. Yeah. Well, not really dispatching. We were cleansing and purifying them. So I find that of intellectual interest because the Zoroastrians came up with this whole idea to begin with. But at least they didn't keep all the poor sinners down in hell there forever. They let them go at the end of time, got them purified, so it was a happy ending. But unfortunately, when that idea was picked up by the ancient Jews, and they developed the idea of paradise and Gehenna. Gehenna, I think, comes from some garbage dump that was outside Jerusalem where they burned trash all the time, and they used it as a garbage dump because it had been a pagan site, a kind of a godless pagan site where children were sacrificed to some pagan deity. And that, therefore, it was the exact opposite of sacred ground. It was a cursed ground, you might say. But anyway, Gehenna became the name for the Jewish hell and paradise for heaven. And so then we picked it up. Of course, Christianity was built on a foundation of Judaism, and in the same way that Islam came along later and borrowed elements of Christianity and Judaism for its own theology. But today, the net result is in conservative Judaism and in conservative Christianity, you have this ancient idea of Zoroastrian spiritual warfare with a heaven and a hell and a God and a devil, and eternal damnation for the wicked, the goats, so to speak, and eternal salvation for the chosen, I guess.
Well, when we look at Babylon and we look at these deities, these Anunnaki, and it's really only at that sort of imagery do we start to see these giants with wings, and then obviously the winged disc above them. Is there a connection between the Anunnaki and angels, and are these beings sort of interacting with humans, giving us knowledge, giving us the flame, like in a Zeus type scenario?
Well, the wings are interesting. There were winged deities long before artists began attaching them to angels. That's true. Various mythological figures. I mean, even Hermes had winged sandals that helped him, zip through the air there when he was on his missions as a messenger for Zeus. As far as polytheistic religions and their deities and how they interact with their followers, there are different ways that the followers of these religions, for example, modern Hinduism, might look at those deities. All religions are really kind of a spectrum of people who believe things as they're taught, and others who take increasingly figurative interpretations. For example, a polytheist who is a literalist might actually believe that the Hindu thunder god, for example, is riding a chariot through the sky, whereas others might see these various deities as archetypes that represent an aspect of reality. And so, that's the closest I can get to a response to what you were bringing up, Johnny. Yeah, but I'd say that they're all the interpretations are all across the board. I respect all the opinions. I'm just interested in them.
For sure, yeah. We've got a Facebook call from Gary in London, and he asks, "Are angels our ancestors, like Navajo Indians believe that they're their ancestors?"
Well, do we have ancient astronauts that help craft societies, help us along? It's certainly possible. It's a little late to really tell for sure. There are those who claim that there's evidence out there for interaction between superior civilizations and primitive societies in the past. And to me, personally, it's just a big question mark. Possibly, possibly not. It's hard to say. Some of the literature, for example, has in the mythology and also in the legends, you have angels getting involved in I guess you might say nation building or civilization building. For example, even in the Adam and Eve story, or at least in the myths surrounding that, after Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden, for disobedience, the Archangel Michael was dispatched to teach them agriculture so that they could grow food for themselves, because they had not had to do that at Eden. So that's a good example of how the ancients certainly held this belief. It was very widespread. And I'm holding that out because that's the first thing that came to my mind. But there are plenty of legends of angels or supernatural beings getting involved on Earth and teaching civilized arts to primitive people.
Now, a lot of people talk about when you die or getting close to death, there's you're heading towards the light. And I want to ask you the question that I have on the list about is the being of light an NDE as opposed to being an angel? But at the same time, we have, what is it here, from Mark from Menlo Park, reminds us that Steve Jobs, who was an atheist, said on his deathbed, right as he was slipping away from our living, his last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." What do you know?
Well, that oh wow is that comes up all the time. Near-death experiencers never forget what it was like to be out of the body. My good friend Scott lost his father many years ago, and it was a troubled family, you might say, and in a sense, Scott actually was apart from his parents when he was a teenager, just fending for himself, and he was down in Florida when he got a message from his father. His father had been diagnosed with cancer and wanted to see him, and Scott hitchhiked back and met him in the hospital room. There was a wonderful reconciliation, and for the first time in his life, he had a relationship with his father, and it took that calamity to cause that to happen. The father went downhill pretty rapidly, and toward the end, it was a pretty sad scene there. When they were draining the fluid out of his lungs and all that stuff. Scott went home that night. They knew it was near. And in the middle of the night, he suddenly just woke up, and when he saw something floating around in his room, and all of a sudden, whatever it was that was darting back and forth stopped right over his bed and hovered. And when he looked up, it was his father materialized in spiritual form, a kind of from maybe the waist up. And Scott was thunderstruck, and he sat up in bed. And they began communicating with each other and really telepathically. And Scott realized that his father had died. And they at first they shared thoughts back and forth, but pretty soon they were just dumping all the consciousness in each other's heads into the head of the other. And Scott told me that he experienced telepathy and found it to be far more superior far superior to ordinary verbal communication. They said their goodbyes, and in the middle of the conversation, all of a sudden Scott noticed that he could see behind him as well as in front of him, and that's when he had another major shock. He realized that he had sat up in spiritual form from his bed. He looked back on his sleeping body still on the pillow. At that point, the father said, "Well, I've got to go," and Scott sent some entities in the corner of the room waiting for him, and he left and went off with him. And the next thing Scott knew, he was indeed sleeping, and his mother had come into the room and awakened him. It was the phone actually that had awakened him, and the mother came into the room, but she got to the phone before he did. But he knew. She said, he told her, "I already know what it's about. Our dad has died," and she, concurred and affirmed that. And he said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, how did you know?" He said, "We're just here." So this is a good example of how powerful these experiences can be and how unforgettable they are. And he's carried that with him and treasured it for many decades.
We've had a guest on, L.A. Marzulli, and this comes from Mario in Boca Raton, Florida. He says, "Are you familiar with L.A. Marzulli and his work on ETs actually being fallen angels?"
Not familiar specifically with that. I mean, I'm familiar with the ancient Jewish legends, and we talked a little bit about the conventional idea of the fall of the angels under Lucifer, which was the predominant Christian legend about that. But there was a major ancient Jewish variation on that theme, in which the original sin was actually not pride or arrogance, but rather, what would you say, lust. In that scenario, you had, and it's touched on very, very fleetingly in the 5th or 6th chapter of Genesis, only a verse or two, and it doesn't go into any detail. It talks about the sons of God coming down to mate with the daughters of men, and that's more than that. Well, that short passage in Genesis evolved into a vast forest of legend and mythology. All sorts of pseudo-epigraphic books were written about that. And one of the major legends that grew up around that was that a group of angels became lustful, looking at the beautiful mortal women, and defied God by leaving heaven and coming down to earth to mate with them. And this goes also back to our discussion a little while ago about superior beings helping primitive societies evolve. Supposedly they taught humanity a lot of useful civilized arts, but also a lot of things they probably... It's a Pandora's box story. In other words, good stuff came out, but also bad stuff came out of that Pandora's box.
So when we get ancient sort of cultures that say that there were these bearded Caucasians that, like you say, they came and gave technology and advanced their societies, are you sort of suggesting that they were angels, they were fallen angels?
Could very well have been. We don't really know. It could be. I mean, there was an Aztec legend that helped Cortez conquer Mexico, because for some reason the Aztecs felt that there would be a light-skinned European-style individual that would come from the east and would represent a kind of divine intervention. It was the appearance of a god. So Cortez was able to parlay that legend and also the fact that the Aztec Empire was pretty much hated by most of its subject tribes. But Cortez only had just a couple of dozen guys with him with pikes. I mean, that's it. He conquered an entire empire, and he did it. With, I guess you might say, this public relations aspect, because the Aztecs thought he was either divine or semi-divine, and then also he parlayed the fact that he built a confederacy of tribes to join him. But those legends are very common. I don't have a hard and fast opinion on one way or another. I certainly have no intellectual opposition to the idea that superior societies, whether they be alien or what, would not intervene. We have intervened in more primitive societies ourselves. We touched off the cargo cults in the Pacific, back in the 18th and 17th and 19th centuries. So who's to say it didn't happen 5,000 years ago? The problem is it's hard to pin it down because it was so long ago and the record keeping was so poor then. You didn't have, Associated Press news bureaus keeping track of everything.
Here's a question I should have asked from the get-go, which I'm sure a lot of people can see on all the social media when we promoted you as the guest for tonight. How did you get involved in or your interest? What elevated your interest in angels, and what's your background?
Oh my goodness! Well, I mentioned earlier in the program 64. I can't believe it. I still feel like I ought to be about 40, but for some reason the mirror says 64. This goes all the way back to the 60s. For some reason, why do you get interested in things? I don't know. When I was a teenager, I was a big reader, and I guess readers just kind of stumble from one type of genre to another. And I discovered the paranormal mass market paperback at that time. Of course, mass market paperbacks are almost extinct today, but they were all the rage back in the 60s. And I really enjoyed that wider world that this type of reading opened up to me. And then later, of course, as a young man, the phenomenon about the near-death experience exploded all over the Western world, and at that time I was a young reporter covering police and courts, had a small newspaper, and I remember I did a localized story on the near-death phenomenon based on Raymond Moody's runaway bestseller Life After Life and his interviews and how he identified the stages of the near-death experience, and even called Moody himself, who at that time was up in Virginia. I think he was a medical resident. I'm not even sure he was in complete practice himself, independent practice at that time. But he was a very nice fellow and gave me a nice interview. It's one of those types of people that treats everybody as if they're the most important person at the moment, So I never forgot that. And I was intrigued with the near-death experience because, to me, for the first time, it provided strong circumstantial evidence for the existence of a metaphysical reality. Here you had a phenomenon that was virtually unknown at the time in Western society, and yet you had hordes of people from hundreds of different backgrounds telling essentially the same story. How could that be? You would have a person lying flat on his back, for example, out of his body supposedly, viewing everything going around him on the gurney or not the deathbed, but the gurney or the hospital bed. And describing all of these events blow by blow. Meanwhile, while he's observing all of this stuff, he's legally dead. Or not legally, but clinically dead is the word I want. He's clinically dead according to the machinery in the room. And then he's revived, and he gives this account of everything that went on around him. That's impressive. To me, that's impressive. Now, does it prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he actually was out of his body and that life does transcend the physical? Well, I wouldn't say it goes that far. Let's just say it doesn't. It can't silence all the skeptics. The debate goes on, but it certainly is very strong evidence. And if you have the synchronicities that I've experienced in my life, just routinely thinking of somebody and they call, have been very impressive to me. I don't consider that proof, though. I just consider it it's not a smoking gun, but it is it's tantalizing and it's convinced me at least. So that's how I've evolved. Later, I decided to when in the early '80s, I realized that I was so taken by the good job that Moody had done chronicling the near-death experience as a reporter that I began getting interested in various aspects of paranormal phenomena, including angels. But I couldn't find I couldn't find a treatment of that subject that was as in-depth as what Moody had done with Life After Life. And so in 1983, I decided to do some research myself and produce a book similar to that, but on the subject of angels. And I came out with a book called Do You Have a Guardian Angel? It was a question, because this book was to be a journalistic treatment. I was going to be objective, as objective as you can be, or try to be. And I didn't want a dogmatic book that tried to force opinions down people's throats. And to my surprise, the book was extremely popular because so many people had these experiences.
That's
I thought
right.
people would be reading it I thought people would be reading it for intellectual interest. I didn't realize
and I think
how
a lot
many
of
people out there.
Yeah, I was just going to say a lot of people do have these experiences, but are afraid to talk about them because they're going to be labeled as quacks. Yeah.
At that time, exactly. And curiously enough, one of my best friends, who I told you about earlier, who lost his father, Scott, our friendship began because he sought me out. We were in the same church together. He sought me out and was very, very tentative about telling me about this story. You could just see it in his face and his body language and everything, because he had been so what am I trying to say, brutalized all his life for trying to tell that story, constantly being shut down, given odd looks and all that. And he was shocked that I just accepted it matter-of-factly because I was familiar with the subject, and his experience was a classic one. So I've retained this interest my whole life because I think it's existential. It attempts to answer an existential question that's important to me. We all want to know if what we've been doing here on Earth is really going to matter in the long run. I'm an optimist. I believe it will. I just don't think all of these experiences we've accumulated and all this wisdom is for naught, that it's just going to be wasted. I don't believe that.
It's interesting because we got a Facebook question now, which has slightly changed the subject a little bit, but it's from Pascal in Lyon in France, and he asks Mr. Ronner, do you know of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth? And when it talks of the sons of man, are they Atlanteans, angels themselves?
No, you said when he talks of the sons of man, what is this? What's the source? I didn't hear the source. Sorry, I got a bad connection.
It's Pascal in Lyon in France, and he asks Mr. Ronner.
Oh, Pascal, yeah.
Yeah, he's on Facebook, and he's asking, have you heard of the tablets of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth? And when it talks of the sons of man, are they the Atlanteans, angels?
I have. I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with that. I'm familiar with with Plato's general theory of the Atlanteans. Sinking, and how he wrote about that, and various attempts to explain it. All from a volcanic explosion that sank an island in the eastern Mediterranean, maybe circa 1500 BC. It's all across the board, but I have not heard of it, but I'd be interested in finding out about it.
Okay, let me jump forward actually to now. Guardian angels. It's really not as what's the word I would say? It's not as ridiculed as much, and a lot of people are said to have had guardian angels, whether it be a past loved one or something, or higher self, whatever you want to call it, depending on the culture. But what's your take on guardian angels? Do people have them?
Well, I think so. Guardian angels are lucky because they had the stamp of approval of the organized religion in our part of the planet for centuries. So, in other words, I'm saying it was okay to be a guardian angel, to have one. Sometimes it wasn't an unconventional theological belief. And the ordinary belief of the medieval church about guardian angels is that first of all, they're the low angel in the hierarchy of angels, from the seraphim all the way down through the 9 orders of angels to the lowest one. And another major aspect of guardian angels is that each of us gets one at birth, and supposedly this angel stays with us until death. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're Mother Teresa, Al Capone, where you stand on the ethical empathy spectrum. You're going to get one, and then at death there's a separation from the mortal and the guardian. So that's I think that we are watched over. I'm not certain exactly how that happens. I probably am fairly certain that our loved ones do watch over us. I know that. I know that my grandmother has played an important role in my life, and it's certainly my hope that she's there, and I've often had the thought for many years. It's not scientific, but often had the thought that she was there, continuing to look after me. She was like a second mother to me. So that's the conventional church position on guardian angel, and I don't have any reason to doubt it.
We won't keep you too much longer, and I want to ask you, once the music plays out, if you could hang by for a quick minute post-show. But Johnny's got a question, I think, from a chat room, if I'm not mistaken. Go ahead, Johnny.
It's one after my own heart as well, but it comes from James in Ireland, and he asks, is there a flat Earth, and, as above, so below, the firmaments above and below? Towards the higher levels of heaven and then higher levels is the question.
Over the centuries, there have been a lot of different thoughts about the dimensions of being, the various planes of being. We are conditioned to be thinking of seven heavens. In fact, the very expression "I'm in seventh heaven" comes from the idea that I'm in the highest and the best heaven. The medievals and the ancients called it the Empyrean, from, I guess, an ancient Greek word referring to fire, because the seraphim, the highest angels, were said to be aflame with their love for God, like moths madly beating against the glass to get to the light. But the idea, not everybody subscribed to the theory of seven heavens. Paul of Tarsus in the New Testament talked about three heavens. He said he made an allusion in one of his letters to an individual that he encountered who had been to the third heaven, and then he went on to add, whether in the body or out of the body, I know not. So there are various planes of being. At least the ancients and the medievals believed it. The near-death experiencers certainly progress from one plane to another. In the early stages of the near-death experience, of course, let's say you're in a situation where somebody leaves his body in the treatment room, and then floats around for a little bit in a physical three-dimensional world. But gradually, I guess as the separation continues from the physical, the consciousness rises and he begins to emerge into a world of light, and at that point usually the being of light appears, and they have a life review where they see every tiny detail of their lives in a panoramic 360-degree spectacle going on around them, and they can see, they can feel and empathetically and understand telepathically and see clairvoyantly everything that's going on around them, including what people are thinking and what they're feeling. And they can see the ramifications of everything they've done in the minds and the hearts of the people they interacted with. And that can be a wonderful experience if you've been a virtuous person. It can be a horrendous and hellish experience if you've not been one. So it's kind of a morality play that goes on, and they take that back. And from that point on, once they get there, the latter stages of the near-death experience take them into the world of light. So there's a progression that goes on there too.
Okay, this is going back to something I said at the very beginning of the show. This isn't something about centuries, more about millennia. Specifically, going to the New Testament, you have Angel Gabriel coming down and telling Virgin Mary that she's pregnant, and then we have Archangel Michael, then we have Raphael, and so many others. What can you tell us about some of these personalities, and are they real?
Well, they have evolved in the mind of the public over the millennia, as you pointed out. There are millions of people who feel they are definitely real, and I mean the whole history of the Catholic Church is a history of stories in which Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and others have interacted with believers and with saints. So as far as these people are concerned, they're quite real and tangible. Michael, of course, is in legend was the commander-in-chief of God's army during the war in heaven, and he's the one. There are many artistic depictions of Michael throttling Satan. The image that comes to my mind is I think Michael's foot is on Satan's head, and there's a staff in his hand. He's the soldier that fights for those who need defense. And then Gabriel, of course, is the great annunciator because, as you pointed out, he appeared to Mary and informed her that she was pregnant with Jesus, and he shows up as a great friend of humanity in Jewish and Christian folklore. He was the guardian of. He was in charge of a detachment of angels that was supposedly in the myth or the legend of the Garden of Eden. They were watching over Adam and Eve because the angels were aware that Satan was plotting revenge for having been thrown out of heaven. This was all explained and narrated in John Milton's famous poem Paradise Lost. And so that detachment was there, but Satan managed to get around it and whisper temptation in Eve's ear disguised as a serpent, and the rest was history. Raphael was the traveler's protector, and many during the Middle Ages and in ancient times, many Christians and Jews relied on him for protection, in the same way that a patron saint might protect you if you were traveling. So. As far as I'm concerned, I've always regarded them as entities of sorts. They may be archetypes that have a kind of life of their own too. It's hard to say. They could be conventional entities as well.
I remember in England we had a TV presenter called David Grant, and he was out on the Thames in London filming for this show, and out of the corner of his eye he noticed this sort of entity apparition that sort of came into his view, and he looked very shaken up by it. I have put a link on our Facebook page for Dr. J, but I wondered, we talk about presenters, famous people that have experiences. Are you aware of other people, famous people around the world other than America that have had experiences with angels?
Lots of different people. Have had all kinds of experiences. Celebrities and whatnot for all walks of life. The first thing that comes to my mind is Peter Marshall was walking along a dark stretch there one night, a moonless night, and he heard a voice call his name out, exclaim his name, Peter, and it stunned him, and he just stopped, and then looked around and just took another step or two, and the voice cried out again. At that point, it startled him to the point that he just lost his balance and he fell to his knees. Well, he then did what we normally do. He tried to brace himself so he could get back up. But as he extended his arms forward to place them on the ground, he realized there was nothing but empty space there. There was no ground. He was right on the precipice of a limestone quarry, and one more step would have been the end of it. Norman Vincent Peale was at a church service where there was a procession of pastors, and to his shock and delight, he suddenly saw his father in that procession coming down the aisle, and the father gave him an old familiar wave. And at that point, he was stunned. It only lasted a fleeting moment, but he wrote that he knew for a certainty that he had seen his father there. And many different stories just like this. So there's a lot out there.
Johnny's got a question for you. Go ahead, Johnny.
Do you know what? I've just lost my webpage.
It's okay. I got it. This is actually straight from the reviewing notes from you. Okay. Well, many people. Let's go back to skeptics. They obviously have a rule book, not a rule book, a skeptic book that a friend of mine was able to get, and it has an explanation for literally everything. Yeah.
I love these things.
Yeah,
I love
right.
These things.
Yeah, and when he presented it to the Skeptic Society, they flipped out because it's it wasn't supposed to be there. But how can you have a book that has explanations from everything? That's just impossible. So
yeah.
So
Yes.
because these skeptics always say, seeing an angel is a vision, or is nothing more than a dream, or the mind, snapping under pressure, or wishful thinking, or high on drugs, whatever it is. But what do you say with regards to that? Because a lot of these encounters actually happen when people are going through turmoil for good reason. Like I mentioned, that case of that woman that was, told to get off the lane before she avoided a car accident.
That's right. And well, first of all, I guess the first thing I would say to skeptics is it's not proven either way. And the orderly mind of the skeptic has to have order. And it's difficult for them to accept the fact that there are unknowns out there. Now, as far as the usual explanation that, that person had a hallucination, they just wigged out, they were under stress and all that, and it is true that people that often it's true that oftentimes you'll have more metaphysical experiences and visions during a time of stress than you do otherwise. Well, it's like everything else in this universe. You can look at it two ways. You can look at it their way. I'm not saying that's not I'm not saying that's not legitimate, but you can also look at it our way too. For example, you could say that in a moment of stress, you are oftentimes put into an altered state of consciousness, apart from your normal everyday conventional consciousness that is not really equipped to interface with the spiritual world. Why is it, for example, that oftentimes people will have images of loved ones in a window, for example, or a lampshade? Why not just why there? Well, it may be an involuntary form of scrying where they just lapse without intent into an altered state of consciousness, a kind of a hypnotic state in which they are suddenly able to process all of this that's been out there the whole time and not available to their normal consciousness. So that's one way of looking at it, in my opinion. And secondly, I would go back to what I said earlier. Thirdly, I'd go back to what I said earlier in the program, and that is there is circumstantial evidence. I mean, if a guy can successfully describe what went on while his heart was stopped and all the machines in the room said he was dead, and that and he didn't have any brain waves or any heartbeat. He comes back and describes what happened during the 3 or 4 minutes when he was clinically dead. How did that happen? And how can he be accurate? That's subjective. That doesn't prove anything, but it would be considered evidence in a courtroom. It would be considered good evidence in the courtroom. What about people who have a deathbed vision? They're in their last moments of death, and all of a sudden they begin having a conversation with somebody nobody else can see in the room, and then finally they die. Or they say something in the course of that conversation with that entity that they should not have known. That again is not proof, but it's circumstantial evidence. Maybe there was a case of it was a very famous case collected by the Society for Psychical Research, the famous SPR, back before the turn of the 20th century, in the late 19th century. 2 girls, I think they had come down with diphtheria or something, and one of them had died before the other, but the knowledge of the first girl's death was kept from her friend, the second girl. And when she finally, shortly before she succumbed herself, she became very excited and said, I don't remember the name, Jenny's here. This is great, we get to go together. But nobody had told her that the other girl had died. So there's circumstantial evidence. There's circumstantial evidence out there. I don't demand that the skeptics believe that we live in an organic, living, intelligent, evolving universe. Even though you've got the anthropic principle. Hello, in recent decades, scientists have discovered that we live in a perfect universe, so to speak. What the philosophers of the 18th century would have called the best of all possible worlds, so to speak. The force of gravity is just right. If you modify it, make it just slightly stronger than it is, slightly weaker, according to the calculations, you don't get the kind of universe evolving where you get galaxies, where you get solar systems, and where you get planets. And without planets, you don't get us. The strong force that holds the nuclei of atoms together is a very, very strange animal. It kicks in hard at a very small distance and then suddenly abruptly stops after that distance. Just what it has to do to hold an atomic nuclei together is almost as if somebody it's almost as if an engineer had designed the strong force to be exactly what it is, to hold an atomic nucleus together so that those atoms and those neutrons don't fly apart. And without that, there's very little leeway in changing the properties of the strong force and still getting a human-friendly universe. You mess with it slightly, you don't get us. And on and on and on. The force of gravity is just right, and there are thousands of these anthropic coincidences that have been discovered, everything from what I've just described to the properties of the carbon atom, which is essential for life. So how did all this stuff miraculously take place? I mean, this makes the most improbable lottery winning seem like a cinch. How do we end up beating all these odds? Well, it's stuff like this that has given the skeptics pause. Now they've come back, they've counterattacked and said, well, we live in a multiverse. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I don't have a problem with a multiverse of many different universes. And in fact, in this multiverse goes the argument, there's such an infinity of universes that we just happen to live in one of the very, very few where the forces of nature just accidentally turned out right. Each universe just accidentally and randomly constructs its own forces of nature, and and if we weren't in one of these very few, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. Well, I suppose that's logical, but it's more of a stretch than to just assume that there's intelligence guiding this universe and crafting it. And in the same way that your intelligence and mine controls our bodies and regulates them. Right now, while we're having this conversation, our intelligence is at work, and all of those molecules are like intelligent little bees in a hive working, doing their jobs. So there are strong counter arguments out there. Unfortunately, this debate's going to continue for some time.
I agree. I definitely agree, but at least we are much further ahead than we were 50, 100 years ago.
We're infinitely ahead of where we were when I was a teenager. I can tell you
right.
that because I experienced it. I lived it in the 60s. I can tell you, comparing 2015 to 1965 we've come a long, long way in terms of the decline of skepticism and openness to metaphysical reality. Thank goodness.
Mr. Ronner, we do have two last Facebook questions, and there is one question I'd like to ask you myself. The last one is from Sarah in Devon on Facebook, and she asked, since appearing on the Donahue show, have you since seen an angel yourself? And the last question was Gary in London asking, before people pass on, and I think it might have been answered earlier, but it says, before people pass on, they see family members, fathers and mothers hanging around. Are they guardian angels? And
yeah.
I'll let you ask those two first, and then I'll ask you my last question before we leave.
Okay, well, let me say this. The second question first. To me, I have a very practical definition of a guardian angel. A guardian angel is simply if somebody in spirit form acts as a guardian or a protector of somebody, they are by definition a guardian angel. That might not be that might not be the church father's definition. It might not be Aquinas' definition, but my definition is broad, loose, and practical. If a spirit acts as a guardian, it is by definition a spiritual guardian. Have I ever had? Have I seen an angel? That's the way it was phrased. I haven't seen an angel, but I've had metaphysical experience.
I'm glad you actually brought that up, because I've gotten a lot of Facebook questions about have you interacted with him, have you seen him? So please continue, because a lot of people are asking that.
Oh, okay. Well, I appreciate your sharing that with me. I have I have had directly and indirectly through loved ones a lot of low-level but very convincing and powerful metaphysical experiences, usually in the form of synchronicities. In fact, over the years, they've been so meaningful coincidences. In fact, over the years, they've been so common that I just take them for granted. I tend to develop a synchronistic telepathic connection with people that I hang around with a lot, even in the business world. It's odd. It's kind of strange, really. and funny at times, where, and I'm not alone in that. I'm sure it happens to all of us. If you work very closely with somebody, pretty soon it almost seems like you can read each other's mind. Probably the most dramatic thing that happened to me was driving. I was a young reporter at the time. We were going from polling station to polling station, getting votes the old-fashioned way, long before the age of computers and all this. And I was rushing to another polling station, and I let my I have to admit, I let my attention wander, and I tried to pick something up in the car. And when I raised back up and looked out the windshield, in that critical second or so, the car in front of me had slammed its brakes on. So there was no way that I could hit the brakes and avoid a collision. That was impossible. I saw that in a split second. So there was nothing for me to do except just take the steering wheel and just lurch it to the right just as hard as I could. I wasn't even sure I wasn't going to roll over doing that, but I had to do it or there was going to be a horrendous impact. And it took me off the two-lane highway that I was on, onto the shoulder of the road. But unfortunately, the car was so destabilized by this abrupt turn that it spun and ended up moving, if you can imagine this, sideways, perpendicular to the road. So I'm forming a T with the highway now as I move down. I'm actually going sideways, probably maybe 25, 30 miles an hour at this point on the shoulder of the road, perpendicular to the strip, to the highway strip. And it's a miracle that it didn't roll over. And I remember thinking to myself, my mind immediately turned, as they always do when you have an experience of this incredible nature. My mind immediately went to my wife, Jeannie, who was pregnant with our firstborn. And what's so interesting, it's a moving experience. What's so interesting to me is an utter calm came over me. I mean, a saintly, mystical type calm, in which there was not a shred, not an ounce of fear. That was gone. It was almost purely intellectual. And I thought to myself, I'm too young, and this is not the right time for this to happen. Because I was thinking about Jeannie and thinking about Abby. And then I thought to myself, my next thought was, well, it's up to you. It was not a formal prayer. It was almost like a conversation. You could think of it as a prayer. And the moment I thought that, the very moment I thought that, simultaneously with that thought, the car suddenly straightened out and shot back up on the highway. Now, it was still fishtailing wildly, but I thought to myself at that point, I might be able to get this thing back under control. And within seconds, I was driving back down the highway, normally, in a state of shock, but everything was normal again. So, that's probably the most powerful spiritual, and I've had various things like that, but that's the most powerful spiritual experience I ever had in my life. I've had mountaintop experiences where a kind of a cosmic consciousness experience a lot when I was younger, still occasionally today, but I'd say probably that what I described to you in the synchronicities are probably the big things with me.
Talk about synchronicity, because we've got a Facebook question here from another Jean, and she's in London, and she says, of late I keep getting white feathers, sometimes 5 or 6 on my bed at a time, appearing about 4 or 5 inches, not from pillowcases, and asks, is this paranormal or angels? And she highlights, I'd like to think of them as angels.
Okay, and what did she say was actually, I caught every bit of that except what was actually appearing. What did she say was appearing?
She says, of late I keep getting white feathers, sometimes 5 or 6 on my bed. They're big, about 4 or 5 inches. They're not from my pillowcase.
I'm not making out the word.
Feathers, like feathers from
a
bird.
Feathers.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. They just keep appearing. Well, sometimes there's symbolism in a materialization. I can't give you any definitive answer on that, but I would say that for some reason what came to my mind was the story of the Ghost of Flight 451, where the crew of John Fuller wrote an account of this back in the 70s. The crew of an Eastern Airlines flight that crashed in the Everglades, killing that crew. They began their spirits began appearing on subsequent flights all across the company, and apparently, according to the book, this is what Fuller was claiming. They had salvaged parts from the wreckage and used them in other flights. And all of a sudden, supposedly metaphysical experiences began occurring. Crew members began showing up here and there. The captain and the flight director quite a bit. Now, as I recall, the widow of one of the crew members, after the deaths, began waking up in the morning in her bedroom to an overpowering smell of vitalis. In fact, it was so strong she had to raise the windows frequently to air the room out. And it turned out, of course, that her late husband, one of the crew members, had always enjoyed using vitalis as an aftershave. So there may be some symbolism. It may be an attempt by someone to contact her. That's as far as I can take it. But I'll just throw that out as an idea.
Okay, I'm going to ask you this because it sort of relates to something that Johnny in London said, and also at the same time was in my notes, yet someone asked it. This is Marco in El Paso asks, why do angels have wings, halos, and are always engulfed in light?
Well, we touched briefly on that earlier. Of course, the wings and the people. Here's let's take. I see where you may be going with this. People often see angels with wings and halos and with bodies of light. And since we talked about how the wings got attached to angels by artists trying to symbolize things, the iconography of an angel has become so widespread over the centuries that it's now that angels with wings and with halos are deeply embedded in the popular consciousness to the point of becoming archetypes in the collective mind, I guess you might say. And so it's not surprising that when you're having an encounter, you may be drawing information from your subconscious as well and embellishing, and which is nothing wrong with that. You're still having a legitimate experience, but you may be coloring it with information coming out of your conscious, and that may be putting the wings on the angel that the legitimate angel that you're actually seeing. As far as the halo is concerned, we said earlier that's an artistic attempt to represent symbolically the angel's body of light, because the angels are creatures of light, and they could show a full body aura, which some artists did. But many of them just got in the habit of using a stylized ring to symbolize that body of light, or a golden disc behind the head of a saint or an angel. But supposedly with Kirlian photography and various other techniques, people claim, and clairvoyants also claim, without any machinery, to claim to be able to see the human aura extending beyond the body. But essentially, clairvoyants are able to see these auras, and it's no surprise that they're depicted and seen, when angels are appearing, I guess I'm saying.
We have angels, we have demons, and demons, they talk about legions, and they have a hierarchy system. What for people that don't quite understand what an angel is, but obviously most people that aren't religious or stuff will have no idea. What is a hierarchy of the angels in a real sense? Is it of a hierarchy of Jesus, and Jesus being the chief angel, or is it something about sort of spiritual power rather than a physical sort of hierarchy?
Well, I guess I would say it would be about spiritual power, and it's important to point out that there's no unified, agreed-upon system for organizing an angel hierarchy in Judeo-Christian culture. It's just, now we have the most popular system, which is the so-called Dionysian system of 9 angel classes. Dionysius was a writer in the High Middle Ages. He wrote a book called The Celestial Hierarchy, which became very popular with medieval and ancient Christians. It was slightly before the beginning of the Middle Ages. Became very popular with them because they thought it was a pseudo-epigraphic work. They thought that the real Dionysius, mentioned in the book of Acts, had written this book. It wasn't until the High Middle Ages that the scholars finally disproved that fact, and from that point on they began referring to Dionysius by the quaint name Pseudo-Dionysius. But by that time, this theory of 9 angel hierarchies had entrenched itself, the Dionysian system, into the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, and became very, very popular, and it just kept on going under its own steam. And under that hierarchy, you have 9 orders of angels. You have the 3 top orders are in the one category, and then you have the middle 3 orders, and finally the lower 3 orders. The seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones, for example, are the top 3 orders. And as you might expect, based on what we said earlier, the highest angels have the biggest jobs, the greatest responsibility. The seraphim stay closest to God, and they are known for their spirituality. The cherubim would be their forte would be intellectual development, and it moves on down.
Vibrate at a higher light level, and sorry to interrupt you there, but with that sort of hierarchy, is there a higher vibrational light or resonance?
I would say that I would just guess or speculate that as you move up, the matter. I know mystics have argued for centuries that as you move up from one plane of being to the other, if you want to think of it as existence as matter, the matter becomes finer and finer. So the answer, I guess, would be a tentative yes. I mean, I couldn't say anything definitive about it, but what I do know is that as you move down the hierarchy, the responsibilities do decrease, as you would expect. And then finally, by the time you get down to, for example, the lower 3 angels are involved in the most mundane tasks, and the guardian angel itself, the lowest member of the hierarchy, is in charge of just one individual, whereas the archangels, one step above them, would be in charge of the propagation of godly ideas throughout the world and so on. But it's important to understand that's just one theory of angel organization among hundreds of them. Many of the early Protestant sects had their own angel hierarchies with additional orders of angels, such as flames, for example. So the Dionysian system became popular, in my opinion, more as an accident of history, simply because that one book was so popular. Another thing too is if you go back to ancient times, not only did you not have a Dionysian system, but one interesting thing that happened is if you pay close attention to the scriptures, you'll notice that the most powerful angels are called archangels, but in the Dionysian system,
I'm glad you
the
mentioned
archangels
that.
are the second weakest of the. So. It's a little bit like in chess, where the queen used to be the weakest piece, and then all of a sudden became the most powerful on the board in the Renaissance era when they promoted her to make the game go faster. But Michael and Gabriel and Raphael are all archangels, and yet according to Dionysius, they should be the second weakest on the totem pole, but of course they're not. And that's the reason. The reason for this discrepancy is because the tag archangel was attached to Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael before the Dionysian system came in. And one angel book author was taken by this, and I read that book about 25 years ago, and he says, wouldn't it be like having a corporal in charge of the United States Army? That's basically what he was talking about. He was complaining about the discrepancy between Michael being an archangel and the Dionysian system.
Okay, here's a quasi-final question. A lot of people, or actually everybody that I've ever heard talk about an angel or angelic experience, talks about it in a positive sense. Do you know of any that have had negative experiences? Because if they did, other people would put them in the category of demons or fallen angels, etc.
Yeah, well, there is a dark side of the force, so to speak, to all this discussion. In the near-death experience, for example, this is also closely connected to what spiritualists were talking about back in the 19th century. Many near-death experiencers said that they, while they were on their way to the world of light, they experienced a kind of a dark, dull zone of lost souls and spirits, washed out, not very little shine to them, you might say, hovering around the physical plane on Earth as they were moving out. You could think of this as a kind of a hellish space. The spiritualists talked about stay-behind spirits who were earthbound because of unresolved issues on Earth that continued to torment them or preoccupy them. There was one near-death experiencer, I think, told Moody back in the 70s that on her way to the world of light, she saw a young man walking in a suit down the sidewalk, and he saw a matronly lady hovering over him in spirit form, trying to correct him and following him around, and she thought maybe that might be his mother. She had that impression. So it may be that there are those that claim that some people just get stuck in the physical plane, almost like a physical addiction, and they may have formed either bad ideas or bad habits that caused them to stay behind. There was you'll have reports of there was one story I'm thinking of now where an individual saw spirits hanging around a local bar, I guess because they had not been able to overcome their addiction for alcohol and were still trying to satisfy that, even in spirit form, even though it was now impossible. So, as far as another aspect of it shows up in the life review that we touched on very earlier in the interview, and that is that when you're in a heightened spiritual form, apparently according to near-death experiences, you suddenly have a much greater and astronomically increased empathy level that most of us have not attained yet on Earth, except for a few saints. And with that level of empathy, looking back on your life, it can be both exhilarating when you've done something right and very, very disturbing when you've done something wrong, looked at when you're looking at the world through suddenly saintly eyes. And that can be a form of torment in and of itself. As far as whether heaven and hell actually exist, some people think of heaven and hell as actual places. I've often thought of them as real in a sense, but not necessarily places, because more mental phenomena. Heaven to me is when you're experiencing happiness and even bliss. Hell is the opposite. So by that definition, we already experience heaven, hell, and purgatory in between every day of our lives, every moment. We go from one level to the other depending on what kind of thoughts we're entertaining at that moment. Emily Dickinson, the great poetess back in the 1890s, she said, she once made a comment along these lines. She said, who has not tasted the heaven below, meaning here, will fail of it above. I think what she was saying was that if you haven't tended to your consciousness and developed an ability to experience heaven here, you're not going to experience it in the afterlife, because you're going to. Well, Swedenborg and some of the other mystics who thought like him basically said a moment after death, you're exactly the same thing as you are. You're exactly the same as you are a moment before death. But let me call the attention of the audience to the top-grossing film of 1990, Ghost. The reason I like that movie is because it's very Swedenborgian. The hero is killed. He's mugged and slain. And he chases the mugger away from the scene, but he doesn't know he's dead. It's his spirit that chases him. Everything looks exactly the same to him. He thinks he's still alive. And then when he starts slowly walking back to the scene of the crime, he sees his widow, played by Demi Moore, hovering over him and crying. And he's shocked because he looks down and sees his own dead body. And that's the way Swedenborg spoke of death. He said that it can happen very suddenly, and at first everything seems exactly the same before you begin slowly transcending. As you begin to move into the afterlife, though, you develop a heightened sense of consciousness, and you begin to reflect on your earthly life, and that can be either heavenly or hellish, depending on your state of mind. And that's the key. Heaven is a state of mind, and hell is a state of mind. So, what are you cultivating here on earth? In a sense, the conventional way of looking at heaven and hell has a very large germ of truth to it. You know.
Here's my final questions, actually 2 in 1. And remember, please stand by after the music's done and we're off the stream.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so first thing I wanted to ask you is I'd love you to plug in all your information where people can find you, your work, articles, anything you've written, books, websites. Plug that in, and at the same time, if you have one final message for all the listeners, believers, skeptics alike, globally, as you could see, we've had, we definitely have affiliates in other countries, and not to mention listeners from other countries, and the show will replay. What would you have to say to them? So let's start first with your plugins, and then we'll get your message.
Well, I appreciate you giving me a chance to mention that. I have a blog called Top Angel News, and from time to time I'll post something that I think is uplifting, interesting to the audience. The listeners might want to check that out. It's topangelnews.blogspot.com. But if you just go to Google and type in Top Angel News and then type in RONNER, RONNER, just like Bonner except with an R, type that in, Top Angel News, those 4 words, and the blog should come up. If you go to Amazon.com and if you type in John Ronner, John with an H, and then Ronner, just like Bonner except with an R, you can come up and you'll turn up some of the books that I've written. I've got one called The Angel Library, which is actually an amalgam of Do You Have a Guardian Angel and various other books that I've written. It's an e-book that can be downloaded on an Amazon program on a smartphone or a desktop. So those are some possibilities there if they're interested. As far as my overall observation, summing it all up, I think it's important to be optimistic about life. To appreciate every day as a great adventure. And when adversity comes, just understand you're part of a larger whole, and you have a place in it. Be in the world and not of it. Remember Shakespeare's words, all the world's a stage and the men and women are merely players. They have their entrances and their exits, and each man in his time plays many parts. So always try to maintain philosophical detachment about what happens and capture every experience, even if it's negative. Find the germ of good in it, and the worst things that ever happen to you in life can turn out to be the best. Well, that's the best I can do as far as that's what guides me.
I agree with that statement 100% because literally what I thought were to be the worst situations in my life ended up opening new possibilities that were not open before. Nonetheless, Mr. Ronner, I want to thank you very much. Everybody, again, our guest, John Ronner, you will hear him again. We will definitely have him back. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And of course, I do want to thank my team. There's a lot of people working behind the scenes to make this show happen. And of course, Johnny Webb, who's staying awake till 5 a.m. in Greenwich Mean Time. I got to thank him for that too as well. Join us again. We will have Uri Geller next week, famous psychic who, on the other hand, James Randi did some debunking, so it'll be a controversial show. But aside from that, we also have a former CIA operative who works as a private security firm and owns it and is a Fox contributor. That is Michael Baker. So stand by, and just all you have to do is watch the website, Dr. J Radio Live. And remember, that's the only thing you need to remember, Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. That's the website. Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, Google+, all of them. Pinterest, even things that I don't even know. So they're all there. That's all you need to do. With that being said, I'm going to let you guys hear two of the listeners or not listeners, two of the guests of this show, and one I don't want to say directly he's been someone who inspired me, but he has, and because we've done a lot of work together in the year 2015 from his brief comeback. And with that being said, we are signing off after you hear these quick messages.
I'm Jack Osborne, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio.
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.